Here.
Councilmember Hopkins, Councilmember Vargas. Present. Councilmember Pauly.
Present.
Councilmember Donegan.
Present.
Councilmember Brady.
Present.
Councilmember Paplaskas. Council Vice President Fabrizio.
Present.
Councilmember.
President, for the record, Councilmember Hopkins' wife is laid to rest today, so he's excused from tonight's meeting. Councilmember Paplaskas is moving tomorrow. He purchased a new home in the same ward, so he is closing on the house tomorrow morning, so they're making final preparations for their closing, so he also will not be here this evening. We'll move on. Please rise and join the pledge of allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Chair recognizes Council Vice President Fabrizio.
Thank you, Council President. I'd like to take a moment to pass along the sad news that Council President had just mentioned for many of you. This has been a sad day for the City Council and the city as a whole. Mary Hopkins, the wife of our Councilman Kenneth Hopkins, passed away last week, and her massive Christian burial was held today. It was a pretty long day, pretty tough day. I had the pleasure of knowing Mary for over 40 years. And she was a devoted wife, mother, grandmother, a teacher in the city of Cranston. And perhaps her most important and extraordinary impact was revealed today when all of her students and the faculty at Hubie Bain were outside to wave to the funeral procession. It was one of the most emotional, moving things I've ever seen. So her impact on this community will be felt for a long time. She certainly had a great impact on a lot of her students and the faculty, and as well as her husband. But it was quite a difficult day for Councilman Hopkins. So I'd like to take a moment to have a moment of silence in honor of Mary Hopkins, if we may. Thank you. Thank you, Council President.
Thank you, Council Vice President. To echo those sentiments, Mary Hopkins was a great service to the city of Cranston for many, many years. She was a great person who believed in her faith. One of the things her son said in her eulogy today was, for the next few days and months, be like Mary. Do a kind act for someone you don't know. Do something nice for someone who expect nothing in return, because that's how she lived her life. It's a very sad day for those of us in attendance and those of us on this council who know Ken and know his wife very well. Moving on, public hearings. This is a portion of the meeting for anyone in the audience to speak on docketed matters. If anyone wants to speak on docketed matters, please feel free to come to the podium. Oh, and before we go to public hearings, I just want to mention that the ordinance to use impact fees to pay for a plow has been withdrawn by the administration.
Robert Wilson, 114 Mayflower Drive. Good evening. I'm just here to bring you up to speed on what took place in court on December 5th with Yardworks. I don't know if you know or don't know, but I feel as though the council should know, as you've been all part of this process from the beginning. We went to court on the 5th of December for the noise violation in court, and that case was dismissed. And it was dismissed because it turns out that according to the ordinance 8.20.010, there has to actually be a police officer present during the time of the violation. So the fact that we had a noise decibel meter set up, and we did capture multiple violations, for which I have the report here. There were numerous violations over the allowable decibel levels. the allowable decibel level on a residential property is 55 decibels. If you give Yardworks the benefit of the doubt and say that it's 65 decibels along a commercial property, which I'll even give them the benefit of the doubt. We had decibel readings of 73, 80, 68, 69, 70, 74, 83, 77, 84, 77, 76, 70, 80. So those are well over the allowable decibel levels, and all of which were dismissed because of the reason I previously mentioned. So Judge Smith addressed the court and said that moving forward, it would be best to call the police and file a report every time we believe that the city is in, that Yardworks is in violation of a noise ordinance. So I did that on Monday. The following Monday and Tuesday I was off of work, and I happened to be the lucky recipient of constant noise in my home pretty much throughout the day. So on December 9th and December 10th, the Monday and the Tuesday, I called the police and made a complaint. And then the officer one day heard the complaint as well. They were doing these loud honking noises with their big trucks that they have, dump trucks. I don't know if you've heard one of those horns. They're pretty loud. They're like a fire truck horn when they wail on it. And so the officer went to see them. And the reason I'm just telling you this is because shortly thereafter, after the officer must have made his visit and told them, he left. And then we proceeded to hear bum, bum, ba, bum, 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 honking their horns in that fashion, as if to say, you know, we don't really care, we're just going to continue to do whatever we got to do. So I'm going to follow up and make sure that we contact the administration anytime that we feel there's a noise violation, and hopefully at some point we can begin to get officers out there with decibel meters and take readings and get them back in court. And so I just wanted to bring you up to speed on all of that. But it's still ongoing. We're still living with this day in and day out. It hasn't stopped. And they could care less. And it's going to be the case until something changes. But we're moving forward in another avenue. I don't know if Mr. Perillo can speak to anything on that.
All I can report back is that suit has been filed with the Supreme Court.
Okay. So that's good. So at least that's a step in the right direction. Hopefully maybe in the end we can get some relief there. I sure hope so, because I don't know what we're going to do if we don't. So I guess we'll have to all stick for sale signs on our properties, which would be a shame because it's the house I grew up in and I really do not want to move, and neither do any of my neighbors. So. But I don't want to go on about this too much longer. I do want to say, though, thank you to each and every one of you here tonight for your help and support throughout this entire process. Without you, we wouldn't be able to get anything done. So I thank you for that. And we're very grateful for your support. And hopefully I can come in here someday and be able to report that our problem is no longer a problem. So I wish you all a happy holiday, Merry Christmas, and thank you very much. And see you next year. Thank you.
Happy holidays. Anyone else to speak on any docketed agenda item? Seeing none, the portion of the meeting is now closed. We have an order report from Bloom Shapiro for June 30th, 2009. Director Strong, you have the floor.
Thank you, Council President. I left packages on every councilman's desk. This is a report from our auditors, Boone Shapiro. For you tonight will be engaging partner Ron Narsick, with his assistants Matt Cadino and Stephen Ross. And it basically shows the activity of what transpired for fiscal year 19, ending June 30th. And there were some difficult things that we had to undertake this year, but I believe all in all we came out as best we could. The administration, I think, worked diligently to reduce the deficit that will be brought forward to you this evening. So with that, Ron, you have the floor.
Sure.
Thank you very much for having us. Obviously, this is not the official audit report. That's about a 220-page document. This is really just some summary results as to the engagement and what transpired and what our reporting results are going to be once we are issued, which I believe we're shooting for to be either the end of this week or early next week. On that slide deck, first I want to apologize in advance. I think only the first 3 or 4 slides are numbered page-wise, and everything else isn't, so I'm going to try to keep everybody at the right place. But if I lose you, so to speak, please just give me a holler and I'll get you to the right slides. But I'm going to move relatively quickly through them. I'm sorry.
Just speed in the mic so the it's not on. You press that button.
Which button? Is that better? Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So slide deck 3, or slide 3, basically is giving you the scope of what we perform the engagement under, or there's relatively 3 levels of scope. So we are performing an audit under generally accepted auditing standards. We're performing it as well under generally accepted governmental auditing standards. And then finally, under uniform guidance, which is formerly the Federal Single Audit Act. That level of scope directs purely at federal programs that are considered to be major programs. I'm going to go over that section real quick because we are still pending some work relative to that, so we don't have any reporting results for you relative to that scope as of this evening. But under generally accepted auditing standards, which is the main audit opinion, which is page 1 of what will be the final bound document in the audit report, we're issuing an unmodified or clean audit report on the financial statements, which basically says, in our opinion, the financial statements fairly represent the results of operations and financial position of the city as of June 30, 2019. Under governmental auditing standards, we're required to report to you any internal control matters that arise during the performance of our audit, as well as any compliance violations that we detect during the performance of our audit. There were no instances of non-compliance that were uncovered during the performance of our engagement. There is a recommendation or internal control matter that we will be drafting relative to the production of what is called the SEFA, the Schedule of Federal Expenditures. It is a rather disaggregated system here in the city due to the fact that you have multiple departments that manage federal programs. We're not suggesting that the current controls relative to it are inappropriate. We just think that there might be some ways to tighten them up and improve the speed in which we're able to get our arms around all that information. If you go to slide, it's going to be the 6th slide. It's the first slide listed as financial highlights. In the financial statements, we're actually preparing and producing 2 levels of reporting. One is under a GAAP basis, generally accepted accounting principles, and the other is budgetary basis, which I think probably is more in line with what you manage to. The numbers can be a little different from one statement to the other. These right here that I'm referring to relative to the increases and decreases in your fund balance or net assets during the fiscal year relate to the GAAP financial statements. So this slide here has basically your fund balance position for the general fund, the school unrestricted fund, the school bond fund, and then a consolidation of all of your non-major governmental funds for the fiscal year into June 30, 19. As is indicated up above, the general fund, again, under GAAP basis, so a decrease in fund balance of a little over $2 million for the fiscal year. Your school unrestricted fund showed a decrease in fund balance of a little over $1 million. The reason behind that is for GAAP reporting purposes, that includes their capital reserve fund, which had about $1.1 million in expenditures, so that's what drove that into a deficit position. Your school bond fund had an increase in its fund balance of about $4.9 million, and that had to do with the issuance of debt and bond proceeds that were reported in the fund. And then overall, again, from a consolidated perspective of all your non-majors, there was a decrease in non-major fund balance of about 2.9 million. All of that really was generated by activity in your capital projects, your non-major capital projects, where in prior years they may be receiving recording bond proceeds. This was one of the years that there was a spend down of those bond proceeds as projects continued. So in particular, the police and fire bond fund had some significant expenditures during the fiscal year that drove that deficit. If you flip to the next slide, we're talking here purely your general fund, and these are just some standard operating statistics relative to the general fund. And what I'm giving you here and what I would focus on is I'm showing you your unassigned fund balance in the general fund over the last 4 years, as well as a percentage of that unrestricted or unassigned fund balance to the total expenditures in the general fund. And if you can see a percentage there under the 19 column of 8.07%. So that's basically what your unassigned fund balance is percentage-wise to your total expenditures in the general fund, and those are budgetary-based expenditures. Guidance relative to fund balance levels is targeting somewhere between 7.5% to 15%. So you're on the lower end of that scale, but nonetheless within the realm of what is considered to be a viable fiscal entity. Your tax collection rate, also another significant statistic, and when I say significant, I'm really relating it to what bond rating agencies are going to be looking at, as well as a multitude of other things, but for the purposes of this evening, I'm just going to focus on these two. If you look at the percentage of collection on your current levy, you see for the fiscal year ended 19, you collected 98.98% of what was levied for the fiscal year. And again, you can look at that comparatively over the past 4 years. It's quite frankly a high rate relative to the size and demographic of the city of Cranston, and it obviously is quite consistent when you look over the last 4 years. So I applaud you for that. Next slide, I'm going to go real quick through these next two. These are your general fund highlights, and these are now not GAAP financials. These are budgetary financials, and this is a budget versus actual analysis. There's 2 slides here. The first slide is your revenues, so how you did actually compared to what your budgeted projected revenues were, and then how you did on the next page, actual expenditures to what your planned expenditures or your appropriations were. As you see, just looking at the subtotals on each of the 2 pages, revenue targets were not hit, and expenditures went over for the fiscal year, which drove not only the GAAP deficit that we talked about earlier, but in just a minute I'll talk about what the budgetary deficit was for the fiscal year. The reason I give you these 2 slides is just to get a little more line item detail. The slide I'm going to focus on really is summary in form. So if you flip past those 2, you'll see another general fund highlight schedule that has both the city and the school budget to actual revenue and variance. So up top here, we see the city overall. You had projected collection of revenues of $288 million, and you collected around $287 million. So you had a negative variance of a little over $1 million. For expenditures, $288.9 million was the appropriation, $289.7 was the expenditure. You had a variance there of $861,000. So total variance, total depletion of fund balance on a budgetary basis for the general fund was about almost 1.9 million, 1.890. Under the school, you had total revenues of 63.8. That had a positive variance of 185,000, and your expenditures had a positive variance of 202,000. Total expenditures there were 157 million. Obviously, I'm rounding here. And then we had some other financing sources, which are basically the transfers in from the city general fund in order to underwrite the expenditures relative to education. So you ended up with a net change in fund balance for the school unrestricted fund of positive 576,000. So the 1.8 added to the 576,000 gives you an overall net change in fund balance, or deficit, if you will, of 1.3 million. I believe the finance director has been communicating that number to you for some period of time. So, our audit report obviously is going to validate that. If you flip to the next slide, I'm just going to show you real quick just your net position in your business type activities. So these are not governmental funds. This is your sewer, your school lunch, and your charter school. And as you can see, from a net position perspective, both the sewer and the school lunch are in good positions. Your sewer fund has about $65.5 million in net position as of June 30, 2019. Obviously, the preponderance of that is the net fixed assets, the equipment that's producing the revenues relative to that operation. Your school lunch has a little over $1.2 million in net position. The charter school is in a deficit position of $738,000, almost $739,000. And then if you also look at the far right there, you've got your internal service fund activity that bifurcates into two funds. You have a school internal service and a city internal service, all of which are basically covering healthcare costs. And the two combined are in a deficit position, but it's really just the city side that is in the deficit position as of June 30, 19, and that had to do with quite a bit of activity and claims during the fiscal year. If you flip that slide, you'll see a slide that's basically giving you what the activity was in those particular funds for the fiscal year. So if you go up 3 from the bottom there, you see the change in net position. You'll see the sewer fund had a positive, we'll call it net income for purposes of discussion here, had net income of $2.9 million. Your school lunch had net income of about $69,000. The charter school, as I said, is in deficit position and ran a deficit for the fiscal year of $216,560. And then again, all over in the far right column, your internal service funds that stand alone in that column, they saw a deficit for the fiscal year of a little over $679,000. The last things from a financial highlight perspective that I would bring to your attention have to do with your long-term debt, and it is the obviously biggest portion and most problematic portion in long-term debt relative to any municipality these days, and those are it's your pension and your OPEB liabilities. So I just wanted to bring them to your attention, and I'm not going to go line by line here. There's 5 different plans that the city participates in. There's only one pension plan that you actually have administrative oversight to, and that's your police and fire employees retirement system. So I will focus on that line item. As you see, that liability actually went down, not a significant amount, but nonetheless certainly going in the right direction. It went from 236 million to 236.1. Overall, your pension liability decreased slightly as well. You went from $406.6 million to 406.3. So again, big numbers, I understand, but they're moving in the right direction, if you will. The next slide gives you some history to that police and fire plan that you do have administrative oversight to. It is a trust fund in the financial statements of the city, and what I would bring to your attention, this carries you from 19 back to 2014, is that very last number down there, that percentage. And basically what that's telling you is the percentage of assets that you hold in trust relative to the overall pension liability. So when you look at it, it's been hanging around 20, it's at 23% now. So that's basically when you hear the term, what's the funded level of that plan, that's what we're talking about. It's the percentage of those assets to the overall liability. So I just wanted to give you that from a historical perspective. The next slide is the OPEB liability. Again, you had a slight decrease here, it decreased about $2.4 million. Began the year at 50.8 million and ends at 48.4. So again, moving in the right direction. And if you flip that over, it's basically the same data that we just looked at relative to the funding percentage of the OPEB plan, which, as you see, is far less funded, if you will, than what your pension plan is. And there's only 3 years of history there, simply because of when the GASB standard was enacted relative to OPEB liability. So those are the financial highlight areas that I was going to go over. And actually, they're in that OPEB, there's 2 slides relative to the 2 different plans that do exist. One's the school's plan and one is the city's plan. The rest of the stuff I'm not going to go over line by line with you. These are required communications from us, the auditors, to you, those charged with governance. Basically, what I'll tell you, you can read them on your own, and there'll be a formal letter that will be delivered to the council president when we do issue. But if you look at these from the perspective of what is highlighted there, those are the topical areas that we are required to communicate to you. And the whole purpose of this required communication is that if we had detected or deemed that there was any bias on behalf of management, we would be responsible for reporting that to you. So you would have an idea perhaps that management was trying to report something other than what was accurate relative to the financial position or results of operations. As you go through those, you'll see there were no instances encountered relative to the performance of our work that we felt in any way that management was indicating to us anything but the absolute truth relative to financial matters here in the city. So I know this is a 40,000-foot view. I'd be more than happy to come back or come to a workshop if you want to dig deeper into this, and I'm certainly happy to take any questions you may have right now.
Any questions, council? Councilman Stichels.
Okay, I'm going to admit that I lost a lot of what you said. So the schools and city sides of the budget together over the last fiscal year had an operating deficit of about 1.9 million.
The city, from a budgetary perspective, the city had about a $1.9 million deficit, 1.8 and change. The school, on a budgetary basis, had a $570-something thousand surplus.
So that would mean that the city had a $2.4 million deficit, the municipal side as opposed to the school side?
No, the combined is about a $1.3 million deficit. So the 1.8 is full city deficit on a budgetary basis.
Okay. And then where does the I think on page 12 it says financial highlights, business type activities. The charter schools shows a $738,000 deficit, accumulated deficit.
Yep.
And does that number figure into those numbers we were just talking about?
It does not.
So because the city is a partner in that charter school, is the city financially liable for that deficit?
Well, obviously, the city as a whole, right, from the city or school department is responsible for carrying on the responsibilities and duties of that charter school. So in the end, It's either going to get funded, I mean, that deficit eventually is going to have to be funded. It's either going to be funded through state and federal grants or local taxes. Probably, likely, a combination of the two, but that would be dependent on the council and what it chooses to do relative to tax rates moving forward.
So do you have any idea where that deficit, why there was a $700,000 accumulated deficit in the charter schools?
We've got our expert analyst here.
Joe Balducci, Chief Financial Officer for the district. Councilman, to answer your question, our charter school is recognized as an enterprise fund. And because of that, it has to recognize the full impact of the state's unfunded pension situation. So unlike a municipality or a school district, where the number doesn't flow down to the bottom line, so to speak, with respect to our charter school, it does. So when that change first happened, now 3 years ago, it went from having a positive fund balance, overnight having a deficit fund balance. I will say from an operational standpoint, it did have a small operational deficit for last year. What continues to be a problem for the charter school is the recognition of the full impact of the unfunded pension situation at the state. So that's that's a situation where it's going to take years, to resolve at the state level. But unfortunately, that's causing us an immediate deficit position within the fund.
So how did that, that school has only been open, I don't know, 19 years?
Correct. It's gone through, I believe, 3 reauthorizations, which each authorization is a 5-year span. To put it in perspective, the year prior to the change in how the measurement of the unfunded pension situation, it had a cumulative surplus of about $800,000. So financially, it was doing quite well. But again, overnight, because of reporting requirement, it flipped. It went the opposite way.
And that unfunded liability is a school department liability, or is that shared with the laborers union?
It is a charter school liability. So as Mr. Nassar mentioned, it does have to get addressed at some point. But again, it's something that either expenditures have to be trimmed, additional revenue has to come into the charter school.
But is there an agreement with the laborers union, the partner to the charter school, that they will pay a portion of liability?
It's part of the state teaching plan.
What causes this situation is because our teachers that teach at the charter school participate in the state teachers' retirement
Yes, I
system.
understand. I'm wondering about, but the paying end of it, is there any commitment from the laborers union to pay the unfunded liability?
No, there's not. On either side.
All right. And then my next question has to do, on the same page, the internal service fund, which you explained as primarily health insurance. And now is that deficit, the 685 deficit is a shared deficit when you combine the schools and the municipal side?
Those plans, Bob, you can correct me if I'm wrong, those plans stand alone. They're not shared.
That's, the city and the school is separate, Councilman.
Okay, so what is the city position and what is the school position?
If I can answer the school's position at the end of last year had a cumulative surplus of about $1,155,000. We ended the year with a surplus of about $651,000 in our internal service fund last year.
So the 685 is just the city?
Well, it'd be a combination of the city and the school.
The number there, it's reported combined because it's one column, if you will, relative to the fund type, the internal service fund. But there's in the audit report, when that comes out, there's a combining schedule in the back of the audit report that stands both plans alone and consolidates.
So if the schools have a, what did you say?
Positive 1.1.
Yeah, the deficit in the city plan is larger than $650,000.
So it's 1.8, 1.9 million?
Your math could very well be correct. I don't recall off the top of my head what it is right now.
But that, also, I just want to comment, that deficit, it's kind of like a rollover from year to year too. So in other words, next year, for timing issues and certain claims, it could be a positive number. So it's like a cumulative. One year, that balance would be a negative, which it is this year, and next year it could be a positive.
There were significant claims. There was a significant increase in the claims paid out of that fund this year due to, I think, a single event, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, and we had also, Councilman, we have a stop loss that kicks in after a certain amount that may not have kicked in at the time, June 30th. So in other words, there may be monies that came back to us in July, August, or September that will reduce that internal service fund amount from a deficit figure. So it's a constant, plus and minus, and it continues. It's almost like a cumulative surplus, how that can change from year to year. Unfortunately, we've been going on a positive note up until this year, but the internal service fund does fluctuate from year to year.
So are you concerned about that number? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always concerned when we see that deficit number. What we'll probably try to do is, when we see our forecast going forward next year, we may adjust what we contribute for health care in the budget for next year. And also go to the employees for additional contribution as well. So we'll have to take a look at it at that time. I don't want to say exactly that's what we're going to do.
But that, when you say at that time, that's when the
But-
health insurance companies
Yes.
come in and say, we estimate you should
Yes.
increase your rates by
That is
X
correct.
percentage. Or,
Yes.
thank you.
Council Vice President Levick.
Thank you, Council President. Just to Director Scrum, through the chair. Yeah, that is, the auditor mentioned a single event. I assume the chemical fire caused us a tremendous amount of cost on that.
Yes. That event itself cost between overtime, injured, some IOD, it cost the city about $650,000.
It was a major contributor to that.
Yes, it is.
Thank you.
Councilman Brady.
This might also be directed to Director Strong, to the chair. Obviously, two numbers that jump out to all of us are $686,000 under legal and $2.4 million under fire, which we're speaking of now, accumulating to $3.1 million of the, obviously we have $1.9 million a deficit, so obviously $1.2 million of that. Just those two numbers are jumping off at us quite significantly. I know we've talked about in the past about looking into insurance, being self-insured as a city. Is that something that we're consider looking at, budgeting and being off by those significant numbers again? Is it something that we're currently looking into?
Well, what represents those two numbers? In fire, there's three items. It's the overtime, it's the injured on duty, and also it's severance or retirement. The legal, obviously, is another line item. That's the fourth item, which is in the legal department. As you stated, between the those 4 items, it's over $3 million in overage expense. We, back in March, April, we tried to be proactive. The mayor did an executive order to stop as much spending for total necessary items, and we did that. The administration's also been very active in looking at some of these IOD claims, trying to bring people either back to work, retire, whatever the case may be applicable to that case. Excuse me. So we've been very active trying to get that number down as much as possible. And overall, we were able to, instead of showing like a $3.1 million deficit, we got that down to 1.8, 1.9. So I think by being proactive and doing everything possible within reason, so much of it is contractual. You know, when you have certain contractual items that you have to adhere to, you can't always just arbitrarily just say we're not going to pay overtime or we're not going to have certain number of people on a shift or blah, blah, blah. So we try to be active within the guidelines of the contract and be aggressive to try to reduce that deficit, which I think we did well over $1 million. Do we want to still, you know, are we pleased that we're showing a $1.8 million deficit? No, of course not. This is, I think, one of the first times I've ever had that case since in my tenure being here. But we're making efforts to resolve this going forward.
Understood. If I may, just a follow-up question. I just want to see if we have any additional status on the RFP that we were discussing for tax credits for our energy bills. I don't see in other, another area, or I don't exactly know what line item that would go under, but, pending that we did get into an agreement in 2020 that potentially could save us $500,000 to $600,000. I think that could be obviously a positive benefit for the city.
And just to follow up, could you say that again?
Sure, the RFP, that, I know that,
Yeah.
the credit on our energy bills.
Yes.
If we enter into that, I know that we've had discussions of doing that. Obviously, that's not in this year's budget, but looking forward.
So you're speaking of like net metering and things like
Correct,
that?
yeah.
Yeah, we're in the process of doing that, and that should come into reducing our energy costs. And we're doing everything possible to meet with different vendors and things, and to formulate the proper RFP to send out that will be advantageous for us.
Do you have a timeline on when you think we'll,
We're shooting for January.
thank you. That's all I have.
For the RFP.
For the RFP.
Any additional questions?
No, sir.
Seeing none, thank you. I look forward to seeing the full audit report in the next couple of weeks.
Thank you very much.
Let's call on Annette Moore to give us an update on affordable housing and housing in general. Good evening, Annette. Welcome to the presentation.
Good evening. There isn't a...
There is a...
Okay, all right. Is there a password, Jason?
Yes. I'm always available to talk.
Hi. waiting for the projector to warm up, I just want to thank everybody for allowing me this time here today. Thank you to John for the invitation, and thank you to President Farina for making the time on the docket tonight. At your places, you have a copy of the PowerPoint, which I've kept purposely brief. This is just to whet your appetite about the topic of housing and its related outcomes in life, and a full copy of the Housing Fact Book, the 2019 Housing Fact Book. So you can actually take a look not only at Cranston, but to look at factors within the state and within regions. Thank you very much, Jason. Within the regions of the state, and compare us to other municipalities. So I'm very grateful for the time here. So just want to tell you a little bit. Housing Works Rhode Island actually began back in 2004-05 as a program of Rhode Island Housing. It migrated to the Rhode Island Foundation in 2006 when we went with the first housing bond. And from there, in 2014, we were adopted by Roger Williams University. We are housed in their Providence campus at One Empire Plaza, but we also do work with students on the Bristol campus as well. We see ourselves as a clearinghouse of information, and we promote dialogue not only just by doing presentations like this, but by partnering with other state agencies and like organizations. Just going to read this out loud. We envision a Rhode Island in which communities embrace a variety of housing choices so that residents, regardless of income, can live in healthy, quality homes in vibrant and thriving neighborhoods. A little bit about myself, for those of you who don't know me, I've lived in Cranston and Rhode Island since 2004. I moved here from Vermont. Prior to that, I lived in Massachusetts for most of my adult life, but I'm actually a native of New York and went to high school in Florida, lived for a period of time in Oregon. I know that's a lot more states than sometimes people around there as well, but it's really not that much. And ever since moving here, though, I've been an active resident. Steve Stikos knows well. I was very active in the public schools, and from there, I've moved on to more civic activities. I am currently a member of the One Cranston Working Cities Challenge initiative, as well as the Health Equity Zone, and I'll be giving a shout out to those initiatives later on in the presentation. Housing Works not only produces our annual fact book, but we also produce issue briefs. We last year launched a scholar series all on timely topics around housing, and our website tries to be as jam-packed full of information as possible. So why do we talk about housing? Well, we talk about housing because it is well-being, whether you're older, whether you're younger. 23% of Cranston residents are over 60, 20% are under 18. We know that housing affects educational outcomes. Our health outcomes are very directly related to housing. And the economy, both at the macro level and the micro level, are really all tied to housing. I also think about housing and planning for housing. This is a British urban planner, but it's a quote I really love: managing our coexistence in a shared space. So really, how do we all live with each other in a constructive and peaceable way? For those of you who haven't heard this before, your zip code is a better predictor of your health than your genetic code. So when we talk about housing and when we talk about your neighborhood and community, that actually tells me more about how you may end up in life than what your ancestors did or how they came and whether you're tall or short. It's really about where you live. We look at this in a term called the social determinants of health. This is a very popular term now in the public health world. But we really see housing as that center axle to things like health and healthcare, education, social community, neighborhood and environment, and economic stability. Housing affordability helps not only the residents, but it also helps our state and local economies. We actually estimated last year that Rhode Island residents overspent on housing by $750 million. So that is money that is going into paying for rent or mortgage and associated housing costs that could be going back into your local economy, or to paying down student debt, or maybe even an extra payment to retirement. So there's a real cost to overspending on housing. Our housing fact book this year, we've always looked at statewide indicators and local housing facts. The last several years, I have been using a regional look in order to look at those kinds of systems that cross across our municipalities. Why that happened? So in this year's book, I'm not going to get into it in this presentation, but in this year's book, if you look at that regional outlook, you'll see information about transportation and housing, which are generally the two biggest drivers of a household's cost. Combined, you should not be spending more than 45% of your gross income on those two costs. So, getting to the nitty-gritty, Cranston, around 81,000 population, a little over 30,500 households, median household income a tad over 64,000. We are primarily an owner community, but we do have 34% of renters. In these particular numbers, what I want you to really look at are those bottom numbers where it talks about the income needed to afford what we're talking about. So in 2018, the Rhode Island Living median family home price for Cranston was $249,900, making for a monthly housing payment of about $1,953. And what that means is that in order to actually afford that, so that only 30% of your income, which is the federal standard, to go into that cost, you would need to earn or have an income of over $78,000. That could be a two-person income, granted, but I just want to point out that our median household income is just a little over $64,000. Going over to the rental side, we're looking at, and this is a survey that Rhode Island Housing does through a vendor. Average two-bedroom rent is now $1,600 in the city. This is a 2018 number. And in order to reasonably afford that, you would need to earn over $64,000. Despite what is needed to earn to afford that rent, the fact is that our estimated median renter income in the city is about $36,000. So what we are going to learn about now is what is called cost burden. So because of the goal of having only 30% of your income go to your housing costs, if you are paying over 30%, you are considered cost burdened. If you are paying over 50% of your income to housing, that means you are severely cost burdened. Obviously, the lower your income, the more likely it is that you're going to be severely cost burdened. And what we can see from this chart is that there are almost 5,000 renter households in Cranston that are cost burdened. I'd have to look at a different data set to break it out to what is severe. Well, actually, no, I did do that. I didn't look at my notes. So apparently, 21% of Cranston's renters are severely cost burdened. That's about 2,165 renter households that are paying more than 50% of their income toward their housing, which means they are likely making decisions about which bill to pay this month, or maybe they're not going to fill that prescription, or maybe they're not going to get the kind of quality child care that they really should be paying for. So there are decisions being made. The graphic on the left shows you that housing costs for owners and renters but it also then shows you what a private sector wage would be in our region, our county, compared to renter household incomes and what a Rhode Island minimum wage would be. So if a person was working full-time, 30% of their Rhode Island minimum wage would only be $512 a month. Clearly, you would need to be tripling up in order to even afford a 2-bedroom home for rent here. So this year, the really big change in the municipal pages is that I undertook maybe a foolhardy project, but I really wanted to kind of boil down what are the housing and development conditions across the municipalities. In this case, I looked at infrastructure, which we've been looking at since we put the regional maps in, and Cranston is kind of evenly divided, and we've got the director of planning here, so Jason can speak to this much more than I can. And we have substantial water almost, well, a little bit west of Route 5. Basically, we have substantial water. Sewer, pretty much the same thing. I think the sewer ends a little bit east of Route 5. So for that eastern half of the city, we have substantial potential for density in housing. And we do have multifamily by right residential zoning, which is great because actually only less than half of the municipalities have any multifamily by right. This information on the building permits is actually from the U.S. Census Bureau. I did actually ask all the municipalities to report. Not all of them reported back to me. So this represents the U.S. Census Bureau's building permit survey, which may not be exactly right, but what I've learned is that it's actually not as easy a lift as I would like it to be. The city of Providence, just as an example, if I had gone by the building permit survey, would have said they produced 1 unit. In fact, they produced nearly 900. I'm not saying that we are off by that kind of a ratio at all, but it took them months to get me that number. So there's definitely room for improvement at the state level, and Commerce RI is aware of the situation. I then also looked at all of the comprehensive plan's housing elements and tried to map what kinds of strategies all of the cities and towns really wanted to use in order to produce more housing. And in this case, we are talking about long-term affordable housing. We're not just talking about any housing at all. And we actually have quite a few active tools in the toolbox to produce housing. Sadly, though, in the end, we really have not kept pace with our goal, which from the existing current comprehensive plan, our intention was to generate at least 30 affordable units per year. And clearly, that has not happened. In fact, since 2005, we've really lost a net loss of 1 unit. So happy to have this as a longer discussion. That's why this is just about whetting our appetite here. On that note, though, what we do have is a substantial stock of units, primarily older units that have been built over the decades with programs, sadly, that really no longer exist. So public housing is no longer built. Public housing was ended more or less in the mid-'80s, as was project-based Section 8. Section 8 only exists as a voucher program now. It does not build new buildings. And both of those programs guarantee rental assistance to the occupant, whereby it keeps the rent at 30% of whatever your income is. So if you only earn $15,000 a year, 30% of your monthly income is your rent. And the federal government has a deal with the housing authorities or with owners of project-based Section 8 buildings, which then expire. So a lot of our state capital sometimes goes into preserving those units. An example of that is last year, Devon Manor was preserved. Its affordability has now been preserved, I believe, for another 40 years. I'd have to go back, there is a database as to who is expiring when. Not all landlords want to renew, so this is something that on that left side of the chart there, you could be losing units. On the right side of the chart, since the 1980s, the way most affordable housing has been developed are through development subsidies, which things like low-income housing tax credits, our Building Homes RI program, which gives a certain amount of money to a nonprofit developer, could be a for-profit or a combination of the two, to develop units that are considered to be at a certain income level. The lowest those income levels generally go are 50 to 60% of area median income. Some of them are as high as 80% median income. So those rents are higher. I can tell you that on that left side of the chart, rental assistance developments usually address people who are less than 30% of median income, which is really just a tad higher than the federal poverty level. So, moving forward, the state right now is involved in writing strategic plans for housing and transportation. I have more information on that in the later slide. The master transit plan, though, is in the final process, but I just talked to the project manager today to say, what can I tell my city council? Because if they have thoughts on the master transit plan, I'd love for you guys to have some input. And she said, we're still taking input from municipalities, so I'm just going to give you a website. You can check it out later. I would really hope that as we work for the next 5 to 6 years on the comprehensive plan, we start to really think about equity in housing and transportation. Many U.S. cities are thinking very innovatively about how to accomplish housing affordability. The city of Minneapolis eliminated single-family zoning, and the state of Rhode Island has now actually expanded the definition for accessory dwelling units. There's all sorts of markets around tiny homes, adult dorms. It is a nationwide problem, and part of this is really overcoming a long history of discrimination that has resulted from really decades of how our housing policy has been created. A recent paper by the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard considered land use regulations as the civil rights of the 21st century. So just to take so there are many roles here. So the federal government kind of sets the stage for how housing has been funded for decades. And there has been equity issues built in from the outset. For those of you not familiar, from the 30s and 40s through the 50s, we had a series of housing legislation. It predominantly guaranteed financing to people of European background. Even for a period of time, redlining occurred for people of Italian extraction and Jews. And then in the 1950s, they were actually also offered FHA financing because people were back from the war. They needed people to buy homes. However, through the process of urban renewal, a number of neighborhoods were removed, and public housing, which had been a family housing program, suddenly became a housing of last resort. And in 1965, HUD was created. We had the Fair Housing Act of 1968. And then through the 70s and 80s, a number of federal programs really kind of changed the look and feel of what was a public program so that it served the poorest of the poor, and it really became stigmatized to the point now when I say affordable housing, people get this image of nothing that they want in their neighborhood. And that is a shame, because people who live in public housing and HUD Section 8 all work, but they often work at jobs that pay minimum wage or are single-parent families or disabled. So these are your connections to the statewide housing plan. What is being crafted right now through Rhode Island Housing and the Office of Housing and Community Development is a strategic housing plan to get us a little bit closer to where we want to be, a 5-year consolidated plan which serves as our application for state funds to HUD for the next 5 years, and an analysis of impediments to fair housing choice. That is the website for all of those. And then Transit Forward RI, these are some of the potential strategy concepts that actually could come to Cranston, including bus rapid transit, regional rapid bus, crosstown service, imagine that. Community mobility hubs, rapid bus corridors, and bus on shoulder operations. There are white papers on that website for all of those kinds of strategies. Cranston is also blessed with not one, but 2 equity initiatives. And I just want to point out that Caitlin Blankenship, the community organizer for One Cranston, is here in the office, and Caitlin Darrington, the initiative director for the Health Equity Zone, is in the back there. Both of these initiatives are looking at opportunity, one more concentrating in the triangle area around Printworks, but I can tell you, because I'm familiar with the whole city, that there are health equity issues from east all the way to west, because walkability is a health equity issue. If you have neighborhoods that do not have safe places to walk, you have a health equity issue. If you have older stock, like we do in Edgewood, you have lead paint possibilities. So there are health equity issues across the city as it relates to housing. And our social engagement for One Cranston, we are looking to address opportunity gaps and to build social cohesion across the diversity of the city. 2 things I just wanted to point out. At the recent Health Equity Zone Speak Out, we did have an activity around housing and transportation. Roughly half of the people who participated in that activity reported cost as an issue. A number of the people who participated in that activity were the children in the household, relatively younger, not the parents. So it's unclear, I mean, it's just an anecdotal thing, it's not a scientific survey, but it's not clear that they would be aware that there are affordability issues. It's not something that adults generally talk about. And then Joanne McGonigal from CCAP mentioned that of $22,000 that she received for rental assistance, $10,000 from the City Council, $12,000 from CDBG. She went through that in less than 6 months. It was intended as a year-long effort. In less than 6 months, they were able to help 22 households with rental assistance of about $1,000. I can tell you that I also sat on the board of the Providence TAP, and that money just like flies out the window. Last week we were at a Homes RI Summit. I don't know, and I'm not privy to what the waiting list is on the Cranston Housing Authority for vouchers, but I can tell you that the Providence waiting list is something close to 12 to 15 years. So we have a crisis on our hands. So let's see. So more resources. Our website, obviously, we also have a news digest if you write to our staff, Amy Cola. Homes RI is a statewide initiative that is supported by about 24 groups at this point, and we are urging the governor to put a dedicated funding stream in. Obviously, we need funding, but we also need receptive municipalities of where to put those homes. There's a number of websites and listservs listed here. Google them. You can sign up for a listserv so that they send you notices all the time. The indices, I would really love for you to just play around. AARP has a livability index that includes not only affordability, but also education and walkability, as does Opportunity 360. These are the kinds of websites where you plug in your address, you will get a score, you can look at your region as a whole, and then if you really wanted to dive deeply into equity and land use, I would highly recommend The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, who gives the long history of how we've ended up where we are right now. And that's it for me. Please reach out anytime. Myself, Christina Brown, who's our research analyst, also lives in Cranston, and Brenda Clement, our director, is more than happy to come and talk. And we are now the home of the Rhode Island Alliance for Healthy Homes, so Karen L. would also be willing, and Kaylin has come in and met with us as well. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Annette. That was a good presentation, a lot of information that's important for the city of Cranston and the city council to know.
I'm so sorry, Jason.
Before Annette leaves, does anyone have any questions? Councilman Brady.
I'll be brief. Thank you very much for that information. It's very insightful. I'm just wondering, comparing to other towns or cities or municipalities, obviously we have a shortage of land, and houses are going up in Cranston, and they're selling over asking price as soon as new development goes up. What type of, we have opportunity zones in certain areas for business, obviously in the city. What type of options are other cities offering to incentivize developers to instead build public housing, affordable housing versus, because obviously it's a very profitable business. How can we kind of pitch that
Right,
to?
so there's TIFs and there's tax stabilization agreements that are being used a lot. So TIFs are tax increment financing. Both of them play around with the ability of the developer to waylay their taxes. Tax stabilization keeps it longer at the same rate. Obviously, those are still carried on the books of the city in some way. There are public-private partnerships. I will say that, one of the things that I feel badly about in terms of, being a resident here and not having been able to really generate any sort of buzz around getting some development done is we don't really have a community development corporation who covers us as a city. CCAP, I think, has tipped their toes once or twice into housing development, but if you don't do it regularly, it's not a really easy thing to do. Because I do live near Park and Warwick Ave, I did bring a nonprofit developer in who I work with to meet with the owner of that parcel. She had a pro forma idea, so whenever anybody's ready to really think about what parcels are available, I live near Chester Barrows School. I don't know what the intention is, either from the district or the city, if any of those properties are going to become available. But I know the Opportunity Zone is the Printworks census tract, and I have to tell you that is a hard row to hoe, very hard. I mean, even in the cities where they have lots of know-how on Opportunity Zones, the city of Pawtucket right now, Jean Boyle, who used to be in East Providence, did an amazing job with their waterfront district there, is now in Pawtucket. And, for those of us who are housing advocates, the Opportunity Zones are kind of but.
Thank you. Councilman Vargas.
Thank you, Annette, for being here. Thank you for the presentation. Just to kind of piggyback, maybe respond to Councilman Brady as well, Rhode Island Housing has a huge section as well where you can actually partner if you were to, if you shall be interested in how to create or become a builder or partner for affordable housing, which there's definitely a need throughout the entire country. I think affordable housing is a huge crisis in the United States.
Absolutely.
It's a huge crisis in Rhode Island and definitely here in Cranston. And by looking at the dollar amounts as to what a potential average rental cost is, about $1,600. That's, it's definitely something that at some point down the line we should focus, and anything that I can definitely do to help out, whether it's with Housing Works Rhode Island at Roger Williams or Rhode Island Housing, as well, I'd be happy to, I'd be all ears.
Great, yeah, I mean, Rhode Island Housing manages the Building Homes Rhode Island Fund for the Office of Housing and Community Development. They also are the recipient of our state home dollars. However, the city of Cranston being an entitlement city, we have our own home dollars, we have our own CDBG dollars. Those are both, you know, tools that we could use here. Rhode Island Housing also is the recipient of the low-income housing tax credits. Because Rhode Island is one of the smallest states, that is a fund that is given out by your state population. So we actually receive the same amount as a state like Vermont, which has half our population and is obviously much less dense. And those deals, you know, if they can finance like 2 deals a year, it's a lot. And there's usually as many as 9 to 12 applications. So those deals are usually years in the making before they're ever even applied for.
Councilor Stichels.
You just mentioned home dollars?
Home, yes.
Well, I don't know what that
It's a
is.
federal program that allows for housing development of rental and ownership units. Rental units, 50 to 60% of area median income, and ownership units of up to 80% of median income. And I may have misspoken. I'm not sure that Cranston is definitely an entitlement city with CDBG funds.
Yeah.
Ms. Wall, do you know if we get home dollars as well?
I do not.
Okay. Stephanie Susi would be able to tell you that, but now that I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking maybe we don't.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Before I let you go, I thank you for coming again tonight. I think, please keep in contact with us on the council through Jonathan and myself. I think in the spring, we should probably think about maybe having a public workshop, something that we can talk more about this issue.
Great.
There's definitely a housing affordability gap in our city. We're going to need innovative solutions to solve it. You know, I've been on the council about 8 years, and to see that we've added or lost 1 unit of affordable housing since 2005 in something that we've all known for a long time is something we have to focus on. It means we have to kind of think about things innovatively. So thank you for coming.
Yes, and I just wanted to, again, not to put Jason on the spot, but, you know, with his expertise, charrettes are things that people really love to come out to. You know, you get big maps and you get colored dots and you get to say, yes, I'd like to get this done here or that done here. It's always, you know, sometimes it's pie in the sky, but it gives people a sense of ownership and really helping to make their city. Thank you.
Again, thank you so much. Unless anyone objects, I'm going to ask that we do the State Farm Cemetery now to get the associates out of the room. If no one objects, move to that.
Thank you, Council President. My name is Tom Moses. I'm a principal in the law firm Moses Ryan. We're here to talk about the Old Farm Cemetery. The Old Farm Cemetery is the rear of 100 Sakanasa, where the former Citizens Bank facility was. Under the City of Cranston Code of Ordinances, as an applicant, we must receive a permit from the City Council to conduct any ground disturbing activities within 25 feet of a historic cemetery boundary. As such, we're requesting approval for our consultant, Public Archaeological Lab, to perform such field investigations to confirm the presence or absence of graves within the 25-foot cemetery buffer. This is necessary for us as part of our Topgolf development project. We need to get this accomplished. We have received our permit from the Rhode Island Historical Preservation Commission, and with me tonight is Mr. David Taglianetti from Carpiano Group, who's their Director of Development, and Mr. Peter Mayer, who's the Senior Archaeologist from Public Archaeological Lab. We're here to answer any questions you may have.
Madam Clerk, will you give the vote on this first?
Yes.
For discussion, I'll do the motion approved.
So moved.
A second?
Second.
Under discussion. Do you have any questions for this applicant for the permit, for the permission to analyze? Councilor Stichels.
So there is a historic cemetery that's there and recognized.
Yes, it's the Old Farm Cemetery. It's really a cemetery from the Howard Farm, the people that had worked there. And they're unmarked graves, as you might not know this, but when they put in Route 37, many of these graves were found. And that's when this goes back to. There's a very, map is 1880.
1887, there's a plan of the cemetery that shows where the graves are located, where the access roads are located. The last interment was in 1916. After that, all the graves are marked with wooden crosses. I'm sorry.
It's not a
First time.
That's all right.
My name is Peter Mayer, M-A-I-R. I'm the senior archaeologist and principal investigator with the Public Archaeology Laboratory. The State Farm Cemetery, the last interment was in 1916. All the graves were marked with wooden crosses. They all deteriorated and disappeared, and through the years, everybody forgot that that parcel was a cemetery. It's actually listed on the 1961 RIDOT plans when they put in 37 as a separate parcel, but not identified as a cemetery. And that's why we're in the situation we are right now. We have a defined boundary based on an 1887 plan, but we need to confirm that there are no burials outside of the established boundary of the cemetery within the 25-foot buffer, and that's what we are going to do with a controlled excavation.
Councilor Stichels.
Yeah, and assuming that the purpose of this is so that there can be construction within that 25-foot boundary?
We cannot construct within the 25-foot boundary. We have to confirm that this boundary is correct. That's what this is for.
Oh, I see. So if you don't find anything,
And the boundary's fine.
the boundary's the way it is and the cemetery stays the way it is.
Within that 25-foot boundary.
So if you find something in the 25-foot boundary, then do you keep going beyond the 25-foot boundary?
Yes, if we do find something within the 25-foot boundary, that means that the established boundary that we have from the 1887 plan needs to be revised. Because under the city ordinances and the state ordinances, the boundary has to be established. And if we have a boundary and we find unmarked graves outside that boundary, then we have to move the boundary and we have to keep going until we don't find any graves, plus 25 feet. So,
Thank you.
Any additional questions? Councilor McCollum.
Just quickly, gentlemen, when do you plan on doing this excavation if all the...
we have permission and we can get the machine delivered tomorrow. We'd like to start on Wednesday because we're up against the gun with the weather. So the sooner that we can get this done, the better off everybody's going to be.
Thank you.
Any additional questions? Seeing none, clerk, please take the roll on the motion to give permission from the council to PAL to do analytical research of historic cemeteries.
Councilmember Stichels?
Yes.
Councilmember Vargas?
Yes.
Councilmember Foley?
Yes.
Councilmember Donegan?
Yes.
Councilmember Brady?
Yes.
Council Vice President Vecchio?
Yes.
Yes. Good luck. Hopefully, stuff that works soon, so we can make sure we don't do anything
Thank you very much.
disturbing that. Thank you very much. Moving on to the business of the evening. Finance Committee, Council Vice President, you have the floor.
Thank you, Council President. The first two items, as you know, have been withdrawn by the administration, 1119-01 and 1119-02, about the eastern and western recreational impact fees. Next, we have a resolution authorizing real estate tax abatements.
Motion
That
approved.
passed.
Motion approved, second, on discussion. Seeing none, clerk, please take roll.
Councilmember Stichels?
Yes.
Councilmember Vargas?
Yes.
Councilmember Foley?
Yes.
Yes.
Council Vice President Vecchio.
Yes.
Council President.
Yes.
Next, we have the resolution authorizing motor vehicle tax abatements, only one or two.
Motion approved.
Second.
Second, under discussion. Seeing none, clerk, please take the roll.
Councilmember Stichels.
Yes.
Councilmember Vargas.
Yes.
Councilmember Paul.
Yes.
Councilmember Donovan.
Yes.
Councilmember Brady.
Yes.
Council Vice President Vecchio.
Yes.
Council President.
Yes.
Next, we had a resolution authorizing tangible tax abatements. This passed.
Motion approved.
Have motion is second, under discussion. Seeing none, clerk, please take the roll.
Councilmember Stichels.
Yes.
Councilmember Vargas.
Yes.
Councilmember Paul.
Yes.
Councilmember Donovan.
Yes.
Councilmember Brady.
Yes.
Council Vice President Vecchio.
Yes.
Council President.
Yes.
Next, we had tax interest waiver approvals.
Motion approval. Motion approved. Second. Have motion and second, under discussion. Seeing none, clerk, please take the roll.
Councilmember Stichels.
Yes.
Councilmember Vargas.
Yes.
Councilmember Paul.
Yes.
Councilmember Donovan.
Yes.
Councilmember Brady.
Yes.
Council Vice President Vecchio.
Yes.
Council President.
Yes.
And lastly, the tax interest waiver denials, which is one that passed unanimously. I urge approval.
Motion approved.
Motion approved.
Second. Have motion and second, under discussion. Seeing none, clerk, please take the roll.
Councilmember Stichels.
Yes.
Councilmember Vargas.
Yes.
Councilmember Paul.
Yes.
Councilmember Donovan.
Yes.
Councilmember Brady.
Yes.
Council Vice President Vecchio.
Yes.
Council President.
Yes. Ordinance committee, you still have the floor, Council President.
Thank you, Council President. First, we have 18-19-07, ordinance and amendment of Chapter 17.24, Code of the City of Cranston, 2005, zoning, solar energy systems, sponsored by Mayor, Council President Farina, Council Vice President Vecchio, amended in committee in November. Council President?
Move this needs to get continued to next month to be heard with the corresponding charter review amendments, which we received a response from planning on, which we can amend the ordinance committee, then handle these both in January. So I'll entertain a motion to continue.
Motion to continue.
Second.
That motion continue, under discussion. Seeing none, clerk, please take the roll.
Councilmember Stichels.
Yes.
Councilmember Vargas.
Yes.
Councilmember Paul.
Yes.
Councilmember Donovan.
Yes.
Councilmember Brady.
Yes.
Council Vice President Vecchio.
Yes.
Council President.
Yes.
So did we include 1908?
I'll take one, I'll entertain a motion to continue 8-19-08.
Motion to continue.
Second. Have motion and second, under discussion. Seeing none, clerk, please take the roll.
Councilmember Stichels.
Yes.
Councilmember Vargas.
Yes.
Councilmember Paul.
Yes.
Councilmember Donovan.
Yes.
Councilmember Brady.
Yes.
Council Vice President Vecchio.
Yes.
Council President Brady.
Yes.
Next.
I did receive notice from the traffic director that 10-1901, 10-1902, and 10-1903 are ready for approval without a traffic impact study. They maintain there's not enough significant traffic impact for them to warrant a study, so we can pass those without issue tonight.
Motion to approve those three as well.
Second.
Motion to close the block. The second, under discussion. Seeing none, clerk, please take the roll.
Councilmember Stichels.
Yes.
Councilmember Vargas.
Yes.
Councilmember Paul.
Yes.
Councilmember Donovan.
Yes.
Councilmember Brady.
Yes.
Council Vice President Vecchio.
Yes.
Council President Brady.
Yes.
Motion to approve all
And a
four.
motion to approve the block.
Motion to approve.
And second, discussion. Seeing none, clerk, please take the roll.
Councilmember Stichels.
Yes.
Councilmember Vargas.
Yes.
Councilmember Paul.
Yes.
Councilmember Donovan.
Yes.
Councilmember Brady.
Yes.
Council Vice President Vecchio.
Yes.
Council President Brady.
Yes.
Lastly, we have 10-1907, ordinance amendment, chapter 10.32, title 10, Code of the City of Cranston, 2005, motor vehicles and traffic, Aqueduct Road at Intervale Road, four-way stop. Councilmember McCauley's
Motion approved.
proposal.
Second.
There's a motion to approve in a second. Councilman McCauley, you want to?
Thank you, Council President. As I stated in committee, this is something that I see members of the fire department here. I know they've been to this area more than once, and I'm hoping that we can pass this before someone gets seriously injured there. So I'm urging my fellow council members to approve this. Thank you.
Any additional discussion? Council Vice President.
Thank you, Council President. Yeah, I applaud Councilman McCauley. I know this area pretty well. I've used that to cut through to the other side of the city, and it's definitely an area that they've had some serious problems, so I would support this.
Yeah, and, you know, last month we continued to, they want us to do traffic report because the traffic engineer has historically not approved multi-way stop signs, and I wanted to see if that was still the case. But I do agree with you, there's a need in that intersection for a multi-way stop sign. So I'll be supporting this. Any further discussion? Seeing none, clerk, please take a roll on motion approved.
Councilmember Stichels?
Yes.
Councilmember Vargas? Yes. Councilmember Paul?
Yes.
Councilmember Donovan?
Yes.
Councilmember Brady?
Yes.
Councilmember Vecchio?
Yes.
Yes. Under election of city officials, this is for administrative purposes only. I appointed Dave Yo, to the cemetery commission based on the recommendation of Greg Miyata. Report of city officers, there are none. Under executive communications, we have a report of non-special counsel. If you have any questions on that, we'll step back and let it happen. I'll do it, John. Thinking it. Okay, so John put that in email. Any additional questions on the report? Seeing none, move on. Looks like we have 3 fire issues. Director Perillo.
Yes, we would like to continue Deputy Chief Robert Ryan in service for 1 year. He's met all of our qualifications, and we'd like to continue that career in the fire service.
Motion to approve.
I have a motion approved and a second. Any discussion? Seeing none, clerk, please take the roll.
Councilmember Stichels?
Yes.
Councilmember Vargas?
Yes.
Councilmember Paul?
Yes.
Councilmember Donovan?
Yes.
Councilmember Brady?
Yes.
Councilmember Vecchio?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. We also have 2 retirements. The first one is going to be Deputy Chief Todd McGill. Deputy Chief McGill has served the city for over 30 years, and he's asking to be retired as of January 10th, 2020.
Motion to approve.
Second.
Motion approved and second. Under discussion. Council, Member McCauley.
Thank you. Just quickly, I think it deserves some mention of anyone that serves in that capacity for 30 years. I appreciate his heroics over those years, and I wish him well in his retirement.
Thank you. And I believe those sentiments will be echoed by the entire council. Good luck, Deputy Chief McGill. Clerk, please take the roll.
Councilmember Stichels?
Yes.
Councilmember Vargas? Yes. Councilmember Paul?
Yes.
Councilmember Donovan?
Yes.
Councilmember Brady?
Yes.
Council President Vecchio?
Yes.
Councilmember
Yes.
And one other, we have Assistant Chief Paul DeLisi, who served over 35 years with the City of Cranston Fire Department. He will be retiring as of January 3rd, 2020.
Motion to approve.
And motion to approve. Another tough loss to the city. And a second. Under discussion.
Same thing, Council President, I wish him well in his retirement.
Again, those sentiments will be echoed by the entire council. Good luck, Assistant Chief Paul DeLisi. Clerk, please report.
Councilmember Stichels?
Yes.
Councilmember Vargas? Yes. Councilmember Paul?
Yes.
Councilmember Donovan?
Yes.
Councilmember Brady?
Yes.
Council President Vecchio?
Yes.
Councilmember Vecchio?
Yes. Council President Communications, this came up last month. Attorney Redector really wasn't versed to answer questions from Councilmember Stichels around some of the questions around the investigation. So Councilmember Stichels, if you want to ask those questions to Attorney Lawson, he is here tonight. He did most of that work on the research.
We're doing the investigation, or we're doing the communications?
Oh, they different? Yeah. All right, never mind. First one.
The first one is ongoing. The investigation continues. In speaking to the investigator, he hopes to have that report to the city by the end of January.
So when that report becomes available, I'm assuming you'll call an executive session.
We'll have an executive session to discuss it and see what direction we need to go in.
Okay. Council President Communications, before I move on to the evening, I know we already talked about Councilmember Hopkins' wife passing, but I do want to say, I urge everybody in the council, everybody who sees us, to go home and hug your wife, hug your husband, hug your kids. It's very sad when things like this happen. 6 months ago, she was a vibrant woman who was doing everything in her community, in her faith, and cancer struck, and it really took its toll. So you never know when your time is up. She went out with grace and dignity, and couldn't ask for a better friend than Ken Hopkins, so thank you, everybody. Moving on, Councilmember Communications, Councilmember Stichels, show the floor.
Yes. Well, the first item has to do with the fencing at Hope Farm, where the fence is taller than it's supposed to be because the bars that held the barbed wire are over the height. And I was a little unclear what the city planned to do with that. From hearing from the planning director at the last meeting, I got kind of a message of, gee, we'd like them to comply, but we're not getting anywhere. So what is the plan on this?
Yes, Director Polo has reached out to the company that's building the facility, and they're going to start removing those arms. I think they have to be cut off the top of the fences. So we told them that has to happen. So they agreed to stop that process for us. They gave us a time frame, but we advised them that it was a serious concern for the council.
Oh, great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Since we're on the subject of solar fences, the other solar project, the fence is supposed to have a gap at the bottom, and because of all the soil that washed downhill, apparently there's not that gap. Do you know if that's being...
I'll have the director address that issue. I'm not familiar with that, sorry.
Yeah, the gap at the bottom of the fencing is a DEM requirement, and it's DEM who will enforce on that. So DEM, at least on Lippet, has been to the site multiple times, has not found cause to send a notice of violation. There has been back and forth between DEM and the developer, but that never rose to the level of the actual violation. So that issue will be handled by the DEM.
Okay, thank you.
Councilman Stichels, before you go on, I did skip right over public comment on any business not before the council tonight. It was the bottom page, so I whipped right by that. I don't see a couple of constituents still in here, so I'm going to go back to section 5 of the meeting that I managed to certify. Good evening, David Adams, Director.
Suzanne Arena, 88 Lakeland Road, Cranston. I wanted to thank Councilman Donegan for bringing up to you the issue with Chapter 12 of their... Oh, sorry. There we go. Thank you. 88 Lakeland Road, Cranston. So I wanted to thank Councilman Donegan for bringing up the issue, which actually was brought to light on the Basics Facebook page, talking about the basketball hoops and how they are sitting on the grass, and you have 2 hours once you get a notice to get it off the grass. And the reason for that was because the plows apparently must go on the grass. It affects their plowing, or it's obstructing something. I don't understand how something being on the grass is an obstruction. I do understand that, like in my neighborhood, there's no sidewalks, and these kids come home, and kudos to them, they're still out there playing basketball, not inside doing electronics, and so I don't understand why we're doing something like that. But in my neighborhood, I see kids trying to get through on the pathway to go to the bus stop, and nothing shoveled. I mean, well, every other house or every third house, and I don't see tickets going out. I mean, I'd love to know how much we've collected, this last year in fines against people for not shoveling. So I think that this is really kind of unfair. Either we need to reword this and have it so if it's on the street, because clearly in the summertime we're doing sweeping, so we want to have it clear. But I don't understand why we have to have it off the grass. So maybe we can kind of talk about that, or I'd love to hear more. That's one. Do you want? Sorry, go ahead. I saw you starting to move.
No,
Okay. I don't know if you had a question on that. I do have a second issue. So the other issue is I'm a former member of the Cranston Citizens for Responsible Zoning and Development from many years ago. And you may be aware that we fought a concrete plant that was placed over by CLCF on Pontiac. And John Cullion had put his Erecta set up there, and he got quite the deal. He got a 1.9 lottery ticket on a $263,000 piece of property. And he moved, and the city paid out the 1.9. Well, about 2 years ago, somebody told me, gave me a tip and said, you know, we paid a lot more than 1.9. Even though I was one of the board members and we went to court, we hired a lawyer, we fought this, and I thought it was settled, that the taxpayers were paying 1.9. Come to find out, through the FOIA that I did, that the city actually paid 2.5 million, and DEM paid an additional 2.5. That kind of blew my mind. I went back to the board members who are quite old now, and they have their walkers, but there were quite a few of them, and they were shocked that we paid this, and why didn't anyone know? So I'm kind of curious. I'd like to know on behalf of the taxpayers what the additional money was, why we ended up paying after the fact. That they must have appealed, I'm guessing. It didn't say in what I had received. But I'd kind of like to know on behalf of the taxpayers, because that's a lot of money. And the problem only became apparent when TL Properties, or whatever it is that owns the Cranston quarries, I had been passing them about 2 years ago, and I noticed that Cullion Concrete was there. I was blown away, because this was a company that was going to have raw silica going into our neighborhoods. And so here they are moving in this area, which again is near the skating rink. And you just saw on Channel 10 that they did an investigative reporting that, lo and behold, everyone's surprised that raw silica is being found in the area. And they're going at, they didn't talk about Cullion, but I've seen Cullion and they're there. They're clearly one of the people that they're renting to. So I think that that's a big problem, and shame on the city of Cranston for even allowing, and I get that it's through the TL Properties that's renting it to them, but I'm really kind of surprised that we would allow a company like that back in the city. I don't know, just kind of that way, like I don't think that that's right, but there is a problem. This is a company that needs to be looked into, and those people, I like how Council President Farina said that we should cease and desist until we find out if this public hazard is just that. Do an investigation. Don't let people go up there until you know. We experiment enough on people. I think it's only fair. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne. I'm assuming you'd like some kind of answer to your question on the financing.
I would.
So I'm going to ask the Vice President to put on the Finance Committee meeting as a topic, just so we can get some clarity based on constituents' comments to know just basically what the finances were and how they were spent, so we can clarify the issue. I believe the administration is looking into investigating the matter at the quarry, and if you want, like, if you have anything additional to add, just because that's, and I'll get you a second.
All I can add is that I have been in contact with DEM, Department of Health, and OSHA. DEM is currently conducting an investigation into PJ Keating, and we are assisting them any way possible. That's all I've been told by them. We're concerned, obviously, for the health of our employees who work there in that area. So depending on what this investigation reveals, then we'll move forward from there.
Judging by notes in winter time, is there a possibility of asking to cease blasting while this investigation is going on?
The city already has that authority to cease and desist their operation.
Yeah, because their license doesn't operate under us, right?
Correct, to my knowledge.
If you could have Attorney Ross just look into that for us, just to make sure if there's something we can do, if there's a public health or emergency domain risk. I know we would need to do public health, we would need to have the investigation done. But Attorney Ross, if you just look into that for us, just to make sure we're not leaving any stone unturned. Councilman Donegan.
Just briefly regarding the Suzanne's or Ms. Serena's comment about the basketball hoop thing. I know the court code needs to be enforced, and that's what the letters were doing. I think a lot of the confusion that kind of spread like wildfire on social media was the letter itself was rather vague in what the violation was for what would occur afterwards. If maybe going forward, the letter could be slightly more specific or add some clarity language to what exactly is wrong and what they need to do. I know that the 2 hours, that's a big question. That's something that we need to, as a body, take care of in the
I
code.
think the letter was based on the ordinance. I believe the wording that Highway Director Parcel utilizes is what's in the ordinance, that the roadway cannot be blocked by the basketball court, and you have 2 hours to remove it. I think you just went verbatim of the ordinance. I did speak to him about it. There's never been, I believe, the citation would have to come from the PD, because Highway doesn't have the authorities. And to his knowledge, no one's ever been cited with a fine by the PD for that. We're looking for, like everything else, compliance more than a penalty. The issue with the basketball courts being on the sidewalk is the rim and the backboard overhang into the street. So when the plow comes by, either the truck itself's going to be damaged or the basketball court's going to be damaged, and at that point, we're going to have a claim. So that's kind of why they want that area, especially in the winter, clear of basketball courts.
Yeah, I understand that, and I, want to publicly thank both Attorney Kirchhoff and yourself. You were very responsive on Friday when there was a lot of questions coming in, so thank you for being so responsive and helping me, reach constituents and help put them to ease with kind of what was going on, so thank you.
Yeah, I do see one issue with the policy that says written, and I don't know how long it's been policy for, I didn't do that much research to find out when the ordinance was changed. But to give someone 2 hours to move it, wouldn't we want to think about making a date, like you can leave it there until December 1st, but then you have to move it to a secondary location through the end of February to cover snow issues, then you can put it back. I could see if that was part of the ordinance, then they didn't do it, you give them that, hey, you have 2 hours now.
Well, a lot of these things are on wheels. What I would say is, I don't think there's anything wrong with wheeling it out to the street, playing basketball, and then the other wheeling it back. I don't see anything wrong with that. I think it's just a permanency.
Councilman Stichels. Actually, Councilman Vargas, bring it up first. I don't want to skip it.
Thank you. Thank you, Council President. I think, and I may be wrong, what Suzanne may be saying is that it's, not everyone can wheel in and out basketball, so some houses are on some of the streets here in our city don't have an actual sidewalk, so they put it out. However, I do understand we do want to avoid a claim as well, and I definitely understand a vehicle going right by it. But I have to also agree with Suzanne's point here and many other constituents in the city, which is, I think that we're, and with the council president as well, which is we're putting out a letter and it's within 2 hours, I think, of the letter being received. So that might be something that we, if it is such an ordinance and I have not read it, we may have to revise and take a look at it and maybe try to propose language or so forth.
I'm agreeable to that. You want to change the time frame? Sure.
Yeah, absolutely, because there are times that I've driven by Park Avenue and there's just no accountability for folks that are not plowing the sidewalk. So while I get the basketball, we're going to do the basketball hoop. We also need to make sure that we're also sending them letters to our residents, and that's going to cost obviously money. So at this point, it's either we do both or we don't do none at the same time. And then the other thing was going to be, sorry, I lost my train of thought, so I'll stop right there.
I'll go to Councilman Stichels and come back to you.
On this basketball hoop issue, I do think the notice was kind of roughly written, and the 2 hours is in the code. So if people should be upset with anyone, they should be upset with us.
Maybe just you, I don't know if we were there.
So I just hate to see the Public Works Department criticized for something where they're enforcing the law. So that maybe if they wrote it in such a way that said, the code requires that you move it within 2 hours, that would give us a kick to maybe change 2 hours to 2 days or something like that. So I don't I know I called you about it, and certainly I think the responsibility is here.
Any other comments on this? Public comments open. Is this issue related to that?
It's actually, Council President, I'm wondering if the clerk or someone in the administration would be able to forward, provide me with some sort of history on that $1 million or 1.2 noted that Suzanne just mentioned. I was not here in the prior council, I'm not familiar with it, what she's talking about, aside from what I read in the paper.
Just to give you a heads up, I don't think any of us were. So I asked you to go on a finance committee meeting, that way we get like a full history of it as opposed to just.
Perfect, thank you.
No problem. Any additional members of the public want to speak on anything? Jess? Good? All right. Public comments now closed. Councilor Slay goes back to your list, and I believe you're on process chemical fire. You're done with the first one. Councilor Slay, you should.
Yeah, just repeating what I said at the last meeting, but this is a fire that cost the city $650,000, according to Bob Strom. There's a report from the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, which I found fairly damning, saying that containers were unlabeled, that there was no indication of what chemicals were in this vat, and that subsequently the company was fined by OSHA, and I'm wondering why we feel that apparently that there's no grounds on which to pursue the company for negligent behavior, which caused $650,000 worth of damage to the city, plus, and more importantly, damage to the lungs of many firefighters.
Right, yeah, I mean, so it was 650, and one of the main rules, just let's focus first of all on the firefighters themselves. You know, either the injuries or the overtime or the labor costs. There's something called the firefighters rule that inherent in every firefighter's job is going into a fire, whether it be chemical or otherwise, and that a municipality cannot recover in, say, what's called a subrogation action. In other words, we pay all this money out, and we now want to sue the person that had the fire. As you may know, Councilman, our own fire marshal called the fire accidental. So I understand what you're talking about negligence, but even the fact that even if they were negligent, and we could prove that, we can't recoup these type of damages. In the Supreme Court case of Dallaire versus Caskell, it's a 2004 case. It's an East Greenwich officer who was attempting to recover, and the city as well, to recover for an officer that was injured in a case where it was actually a negligent dog bite and a slip and fall. So it was a lot of moving parts in that case. But the Supreme Court confirmed that Rhode Island has what's called a firefighter's rule. That inherent...
I'm sorry, has a firefighter's rule? Is that what you said?
Yes, it's called the firefighter rule. It actually applies also to police officers. That became the generic rule. It's a nationwide kind of term of art, where when a firefighter signs up for the job, is injured on the job, or some action or inaction by another party causes either injury, and it actually includes property damage, that those are risks that are primary to that job, that essentially the firefighter and the city assume the risk. One of the reasons is that there's all different kinds of companies and entities in all towns and cities. They might have a fire, they might have a police emergency. We are not able to sue them to recoup our costs. It's almost like we're all part of the same group as a municipality, and the firefighter assumes the risk of going into that fire. And so whatever costs or expenses are basically eaten by the city. And it becomes a big issue because cities sometimes expend millions of dollars. I think it was the Worcester fire, you may recall, it was about 10, 15 years ago. And that was a mill that was left alone, and they tried to sue the property owner in that case, in the Massachusetts case. And again, the city of Worcester that actually lost, I believe it was 8 to 10 lives, could not recover even under a wrongful death action.
because that fire, for good, bad, or ugly, is something that's assumed the risk by the city as well as the firefighter personnel. So any cost, whether it's OT, IOD, medical, property damage, that's something unfortunately has to be absorbed by the municipality. And I can tell you, if you bring a suit for it, and people can sue, there would probably be a summary judgment on all the claims, which would be a dismissal. And assumption of the risk, that every firefighter and or police officer or any personnel emergency primarily assumes the risk. In other words, it is inherent in the job, the danger that they could face. Secondly, is also fundamental concepts of justice. The firefighter, again, this goes to the firefighter personally, but the firefighter recovers through the municipality their benefits. In other words, the firefighter might be injured, but they're not going to lose their wages or lose their medical care because, as we know, they're well compensated for their job. And that's actually one of the kickers. We always talk about, obviously budget-wise, the firefighters, but that's kind of baked into it, that the firefighter isn't experiencing losses because they have the compensation. And that's the second tenet, which is fundamental concepts of justice. In other words, the firefighter is recouped. Now, the city has losses, but that's something the city has to absorb. Basically, primary assumption of the risk is assumption of the risk by operation of law. It arises from the fact that public safety officers, upon beginning and performing their job as government employees, are hired for the specific purpose of having them assist people in dangerous situations. By accepting such employment, they assume as a matter of law all the normal risks of incurring personal injuries that are inherent in their duties. They are deemed to assume such risk because the tax-paying public employs these officers to assist them in confronting dangerous situations and compensates them to confront such risks. So while we have a $650,000 bill to recover against a party that might have been negligent, and when you talk about negligence, Councilman, I will say our fire marshal did call the fire itself accidental. So when for example, if it's an abandoned building and there's an accidental fire and a firefighter goes in there and falls through the floor and passes away, that might seem, well, whoever owned that property kept it in a derelict condition and they should pay for our death benefits. No, that's what you look at is the fact that it's a firefighter who approached a fire, and we all bear that cost in the city of Cranston and the state around it. And it is frustrating because it's a lot of money. But this was also, my understanding, this was a chemical operation, correct? This was a chemical. So, in and of itself. Now, there are some extreme cases where there was intentional acts. In other words, where firefighters approached a situation and there was an intentional act. But it's my understanding here there is no wrongful, reckless, intentional act, from what I know. So.
Thank you for the thorough answer.
Okay, thanks.
Councilor Sligo, you have administrative report decommissioning so far?
Yes, just to get back to what we discussed last month, we do have a decommissioning bonds for gold medal, or Libet as it's called. We also have one for the 7 Mile Road project number 1. So those are on file. They were done by Dupree, who also did the project, which is, let's say, not the best practice to have the same company do the same decommissioning report. So we are going to address that going forward and make sure that that report is different from the company. So the one we're working on right now, that Director Brazil is working on, is the one for Hope. And he's reached out to that developer and told him that he needs to hire X company and pay for it. The other question you had about the 1%, industry standard. The only thing they could add, that Mr. Murray added from Southern Sky, was that that bond money is in an interest-bearing account, so that money should be growing over the next 20 years, which may cover that 1% inflation if it does need to be higher than that. So that's kind of where we are at. I can send you that. You guys, you have the one for gold medal, I believe, the document.
I have the one that Dupree did.
Yes.
Well, actually, there are two.
Yeah,
but
that's
the
gold
same.
medal. I have the other one for 7 Mile Road.
I think they need to be told they have to do an independent, they have to pay for an independent.
Well, I spoke to our attorney regarding that, and he said the ordinance doesn't specify it needs to be a different company. All it specifies is that it has to be done. So, again, going forward, I think you're right, it should be a different company, but because the ordinance doesn't state it needs to be a separate company from what the company was contracted with originally, I don't think we're going to have any legs to stand on trying to get Southern Sky to do 2 more decommissioning bond notifications.
Yeah, I don't have the wording in front of me.
I think I have it here.
All right, well, I'll read that and then, I guess, talk to you, but would you have the wording there? I mean, doesn't it say hired?
Hired by
chosen
the
by the city?
paid for, yes, it does. But we accepted the reports from Lippert/Gold Medal. We accepted the reports from 7 Mile Road #1. So to go back and make them do new ones, I think would be unfair.
Oh, I think to not make them do new ones could be incredibly expensive 30 years from now. I mean, I won't be here, but.
I won't be here either.
Yeah. And I can't imagine that took that much effort by Mr. Dupree looking at it.
I don't know what's entailed in that.
I don't either. I don't want to pretend that I do, but it's just a few numbers on one piece of paper.
I mean, I'll speak to our attorney again, I just don't,
But
from his
I mean,
perspective.
a cleanup of a site like that could be, could be millions of dollars. And what's he got it down there for, 230,000 or something?
Yes. I can't think he's that far off. You think it's millions of dollars it should be?
Could be. We don't know what they go, I was reading about, this is now a problem in West Virginia with coal companies, because they go bankrupt, and they say, well, we don't have any money. And when that provision was decided in West Virginia on coal companies, coal was doing great. The thought that the assets of a coal company would be worthless or not worth much was a ridiculous thought. Well, 30 years from now, that may be just complete junk. And they may want to write a check for $230,000 and then just disappear.
I'm assuming the scrap's going to be probably more worthy than anything else for those areas. But I can discuss it with the
might
attorney.
be right, but we don't know what's going to happen in 30 years. And to put in a 1% inflation, and is there, to raise, you mentioned interest.
Yep.
Is there a provision that the city gets to keep the interest?
In the ordinance, I don't think so.
No, there isn't in the ordinance, so it could be in an interest-bearing account, and they could just take the interest.
I think a good remedy may be to see what comes in the decommissioning report from Hope, to see what that number is. I know Hope is smaller than the correct director. So that might be a good barometer to see what Hope comes in at, and then if it's, say if Hope's $500,000,
Right.
then there could be a problem with the one on Lippert, and we can look at that again.
That seems like a good approach.
Thanks.
All right, that's it, thank you.
Vice President, follow-up?
I'd like to follow up on that, Director How much, so is it $230,000 cash bond that's been posted?
Yes.
Okay. And there's no mention in our ordinance about a surety bond or corporate bond.
It gives 2 or 3 different examples of what's allowed in the ordinance. Form a surety, either through escrow account, bond, or otherwise to cover the cost of removal, the city must remove.
Okay. So my only suggestion would be, if Council President, if you'd like, I could put the issue on my finance calendar to discuss, what would be appropriate, maybe after we get that other report on but I think we need to look at it. I know some municipalities in Massachusetts have had some issues with this. The technology changes so fast, it renders the equipment, it may render the equipment useless, and then what do you do with it?
I'm actually going to kind of hold conversation on this for that, because this is a couple of the solar ordinances are on the upcoming dockets. I wouldn't want to make we're starting an open discussion on something that's on the future docket, like open meetings laws, but I do agree on the idea of putting on a future finance committee meeting once we have all the information. Any other council communications on the floor tonight? Council Whitman?
Yeah, just one other thing, we were able to get flowers to the funeral home. Just wanted to let everyone know. In case you didn't know, we did do it.
There are flowers from the entire city.
Yeah. And I looked on the next, I guess I want to put the technology issue, just an update, maybe on finance calendar, just because to see how we did with our budgeting and everything, on all the technology changes. That's it.
Anything else? Section meeting is now closed. Old business, there is no old business. Introduction of new business. I'll take motions on all new business to the proper committee after. Second. Thank you. I have a motion on business to the correct committee. And second, on discussion. Seeing none, clerk, please take the roll.
Councilmember Stichels?
Yes.
Councilmember Vargas? Yes. Councilmember Foley?
Yes.
Councilmember Donegan?
Yes.
Councilmember Brady?
Yes.
Councilmember Fitzgerald?
Yes.
Yes. Miscellaneous business on the clerk's desk. We took care of State Farm Cemetery, State Fire Marshal notification of a blasting permit, and the zoning map. Madam Clerk, any votes on those or any discussion?
No, that's just for information to council.
Okay. With that, the City Council's next regular monthly meeting will be on January 27th, 2020. Happy holidays. Dr. Staples, yes?
Yeah. Can you tell us when the committee meetings are? At least last I checked, it wasn't on the website.
January, the first Monday in January is Finance and Safety, it's January 6th. And the committee meetings are January 16th, Public Works and Ordinance.
So the 5th is Finance and Safety Services, and the
January 6th. They should be on the website.
they should be.
Yeah, probably they'll roll over the new website from 19 to 20. They probably don't have to do something. So, Madam Clerk, can you just check with Jay? Oh, he is on now? Okay, so they should be on the website.
Sorry.
Motion adjourned?
So moved.
Second? Second. Madam, all those in favor?
Aye.